And then he cleaves a mountain in twain. That might be one of the coolest moments in all of video games. Also, that's an amazing pose right there. Chrono Trigger. This has been a long time coming. This is a game that is very near and dear to my heart, and I think quite a lot of people consider this to be one of the greatest RPGs of all time, one of the greatest Super Nintendo games of all time, one of the greatest games of all time. And honestly, I don't necessarily think they're wrong. This was the marriage of the Final Fantasy creator Hironobu Sakaguchi, the writing talents of the incredible Yuji Horii, and the incredible artistic style of the late Akira Toriyama, may he rest in peace. For fans of Square games that refused to play Enix games, this was your only shot at getting that combination because you didn't get Dragon Quest because those used to be two separate companies that competed with one another. Chrono Trigger is, to my memory, as bad as it is, the very first RPG I ever interacted with, and there was nothing quite like it that I had ever played before. And as a huge RPG guy, I'm sure you can imagine that when I got to play this game, I absolutely hated this game. I hated this game, and I hated that I hated this game, because I knew this was an amazing, super special game that I wanted to be more and more of a part of. Unfortunately, this was a game that, as a kid, always broke it down to I didn't like it being a game about numbers, that my enemies' numbers were higher than my numbers or vice versa, and that was what dictated the fight. And because I was so adverse to, grinding and gaining stats, I actively tried to avoid every fight I could while I played it, so much so that I found like 1 pixel gaps between enemies to avoid fights. And that worked! Up until the third boss fight, which curb stomped me and I couldn't get any further, and that was about as far as I could get as a kid. And it wasn't until much later that I played an action RPG that I kind of got over that and found a niche that really helped me gently get myself more into the traditional RPG aspect of it. I always wanted to go back and try Chrono Trigger once again because I knew it was a special game and it would be kind of a one-of-a-kind experience for me. Unfortunately, someone stole my video store's copy of it, so I only ever got to rent it once. Since then, I had asked every Christmas until I was in high school to get a copy, and I just didn't. Later on, I managed to get a copy on the DS, as well as getting a PS1 copy digitally, but I'd never finished this game. Well, just before I lost my job, I decided to stupidly spend my money and buy this. Although in my defense, I did think I had about 3 months more work that I was promptly then told I didn't. Not my smartest financial decision ever, but it's an amazing game and I don't regret it. And I finally could get that closure of finishing Chrono Trigger and experiencing the original Super Nintendo version as it was designed. And I have to admit, having grown older and gotten a much greater respect for RPGs, this really is a truly one-of-a-kind experience that will probably stay with me forever. The overall story to Chrono Trigger is very well told. It starts out kind of with a day-to-day, dealing with immediate problems sort of situation to ease you into the game. Then it just hits you several hours in with what the actual plot is about. You start with this red-headed weeb who's running around with a katana, so this is basically my life story. He's not quite a mute because he does have all of 2 text boxes in one of the most obscure endings this game has. But he's going to the nearby fair. See, it's the year 1000 and they have to celebrate the millennium. And it also happily coincides with the victory over a bunch of monsters that happened over this kingdom 400 years ago, so there's lots to celebrate. And this fair is actually pretty interesting because it's filled with tons of little bits of story as well as mini-games that all come back to play in the game itself. Sure, the narrative bits are a little bit more overt, but there is a race going on, and later on in the game there's also a race you can take part in, although it's a very different kind of race. I'd still say it's pretty much the same thing. There is a drinking contest you can take part in, and this will be important later in the game as well, as you have to take part in a later one with much, much higher stakes. There's a timing minigame which forces you to subtly understand how timing will be important in the action sequences in this game, as it does have a semi-active time battle system. There's a combat simulator, and you can even steal this guy's lunch. Don't steal this guy's lunch, it's a dick move. While at the fair, you run into this random girl who's totally not important, but she also has a completely unique sprite in this game, and she doesn't quite seem to know what her own name is. I'm sure that's totally fine. You decide to hang out with her for a bit, and she'll comment on all the different interactions you have while in the fair. Eventually, you'll go meet your best friend Luca, who is definitely just a Raleigh-chan. Like, seriously, she's got purple hair, glasses, her father's an inventor, and she is definitely a robot. She, like her old man, is an inventor, and she's been working on something that will revolutionize the world. A teleport system. All you have to do is stand in the left one. For the love of God, don't stand in the right one, it's a bad idea. And if you stand in the left one, you'll teleport to the right one. And you can do this as many times as you want. Your new mysterious blonde friend decides she wants to try it as well, but that mysterious necklace she had when you first ran into her that definitely doesn't make her special in any way whatsoever, I can't stress that enough, decides to suddenly rip open a hole in the fabric of space itself, and you being the hero man guy of the day, decide to go in after her. Weirdly enough, you find yourself in this weird, sort of kind of parallel variation of the world you were in. The kingdom's even called the same thing. You find your friend dressed as the queen because she apparently looks exactly like the queen of this kingdom. But I'm sure it doesn't mean anything whatsoever because she's just a random girl. It's fine. It's fine. Except it's not fine because she suddenly disappears. Fortunately, your friend Lucas shows up and explains that you're not in some weird parallel dimension, you're actually just back in time. And your friend who's totally not special in any way whatsoever, yeah, she's actually the princess from your time, and she's actually dead now. Or rather, she never existed because her ancestor from this time has been kidnapped. So you go on a quest to find her, teaming up with a noble frogman to go fight a bunch of monsters from that war 400 years ago. When you manage to retrieve the queen and send her back to her kingdom, your friend mysteriously appears again because, you know, that's how timelines work and stuff, and you go home. Except now you've got a more pressing issue. See, you know your friend who wasn't important? Yeah, like I said, she's actually the princess, and you're now charged with kidnapping her. So now you have to go on trial to explain what's going on. Now fortunately, if you're a good person, all the things you did at the fair will actually come back narratively and people will speak to your character that you're actually a great guy. Or if you stole that guy's lunch, it will turn out that no, you're not a great guy and you should definitely be put to death. Except it doesn't matter what happens because you'll be put to death either way because it seems the Chancellor has a bit of an axe to grind like that fake Chancellor from the past that you fought that one time. I wonder if there's a connection there. Either way, you run into your friend Luca as well as the princess lady, and you stage a prison break, which leads you through another tear in time to a more mysterious, bleak world, where humanity is on the verge of destruction. The world is completely decimated, and all hope seems lost. Slowly stumbling around this world, you find that you are actually very, very far in the future, and you discover what exactly happened. Since you've been mostly wandering around, flying by the seat of your pants at this point, and not having a home to go back to because, you know, you're a wanted criminal, you decide to try and change the future for the better, and give humanity a fighting chance. And that is the plot of Chrono Trigger. From here on out, you will be traveling to multiple time periods, meeting new friends, making new enemies, and trying desperately to save humanity from this monster of unfathomable power that will only get stronger the more you fight. This game is incredibly grim and dark, and it's a very complex story. This is a game that has possibly the most diverse cast of characters, ranging from different walks of life and time periods. And what's most amazing to me about this is not only that you have a diverse cast of characters that all have different mannerisms and ways of speaking and life experiences, it's an ensemble piece where every character has to contribute to the plot in some way or another. They are their own characters with their own lives and their own experiences and very, very deeply written characters that will affect the story in their own way. And they have to take charge and they have to lead the development of the plot in their own way each. And this is an RPG that has the villains written just as interestingly and as multifaceted as the protagonists. You get the sense that every single villain has their own aspirations, their lives, their goals, their dreams, and they're ultimately all being worked towards them. They're not just some generic villain who you have to defeat because they're evil and you're good. There's a lot more to them. And it makes them feel a lot more real and human, even though very few of them actually are human. This, to me, was one of the most important things about Chrono Trigger when I first played it back in the day. I had never seen a game with such a diverse cast of characters, with such high stakes, being told in such a grandiose manner, and on a scale I had never seen before, and to this day I still don't think there's anything that quite comes close to the scope of the story that Chrono Trigger ultimately tries to tell. This is a very special story, and even then I think there was a lot more to it. When I was a child, I understood that the plot to Chrono Trigger was very, very important, but honestly, I'm not sure I knew why. Like, okay, yeah, it's a time travel, world-spanning adventure where you're ultimately trying to save the world by stopping the apocalypse. Yeah, it's an adventure on a grand scale that I had never seen before, but it always felt like there was something more, and I don't think I could have honestly put words to why. While I was streaming this, I think it finally hit me why this story is so meaningful to me, or at least as an adult, I've grown to better appreciate what the plot of this game is, or at least I've taken on a new interpretation of it. And that is that the plot to Chrono Trigger is ultimately an existential nightmare. Every single character in this story is effectively staring down the barrel of a gun in the sense of the apocalypse. However, with maybe the exception of Robo, none of them are effectively going to be directly affected by Lavos' destruction of the planet. That isn't to say it doesn't affect them, and it isn't to say that it isn't something that they should deal with, being the heroic youths that they are, but I mean, while on the macro scale they are all effectively staring down this inevitable apocalypse, and they've taken it upon themselves to try and do something about it, in spite of the fact that the harrowing, destroyed landscape in front of them says that they probably won't be able to do it, and indeed if you challenge Lavos early, you will get smashed, and it really does hit home just how stacked against the odds things really are here. I mean more on the micro scale. Each and every character in this game, with maybe the exception of Isla, feels, ironically in this adventure about time travel, like they're completely trapped in time. These characters all feel almost as if they have absolutely no future to move on to, that at most they will just live out their days, spinning their wheels until they die. Marl, Luca, and Chrono are all effectively wanted criminals on the run, and while Marl might be able to get out of it with her personal connections, there's a whole plot going on in the background that says she is effectively not safe. And even if we don't include that in Marl's whole situation, she would still ultimately be trapped in a life that she's actively trying to get away from. Glenn is sitting in a hole in a giant puddle of depression waiting to die. So much so that when his right as a hero has been taken away from him and stolen by a child who then goes off to a mountain to fight all the monsters on his own, inevitably to be absolutely murdered by them, he does nothing to stop it. Because he's so distraught by the loss of his friend and the curse that's been put upon him, and the overarching problem of his entire cowardice that has plagued him his whole life, that he cannot take action. He's just seemed to have lost any sense of self-worth. And even when Frog finally manages to take up his sword again, it's entirely for revenge. And it's not until he either gets that revenge or ends up absolving the person he holds responsible for everything wrong in his life that he can finally move on. Robo is considered a defective unit and is actively hunted down by his friends to be destroyed. Magus is like the only person actively trying to move forward in his life, and it's with a blind hunt for revenge to try and stop the tragedy that has befallen him, or at least get something for all the pain he's had to suffer. And even in trying to take action in his life to move forward, he's stuck living in the past, trying to contextualize his own sadness and the misery he's felt his entire life. Hell, Magus is effectively an optional character, and when he finally has the moment to join you, he tries to goad you into fighting him, to kill him so that Frog can finally get his revenge, and ultimately he can have some sense of closure for all the pain he's felt in his life just by ending it. And it's by turning him down and saying he's not worth it, and ultimately absolving Frog's pain of him, that he loses any sort of sense of being, to the point where he has to join you to try and gain some sort of sense of worth and existence in this world that has completely done nothing but destroy him over and over again. Isla's maybe the only character that doesn't actively feel like they're trapped in their own existence, and that's because she's dedicated her entire life to war. And even so, by the end of her arc, that gets stripped away from her, kind of removing her entire sense of identity. Shala was probably one of the most important characters in the plot. She was effectively a kind-hearted woman, but an innocent bystander in all this. Her mother decided to utilize her power to summon Lavos early, and whether you believe that Lavos was controlling her to do this, or she was just a power-hungry woman who was already utilizing Lavos' abilities as a geothermal reactor and a source of magic via the Dreamstone, it doesn't really matter the why of it, but more the end result of the fact it happens. Shala gets utilized to summon Lavos, and a bunch of bad stuff happens, but after that she just sort of disappears in the plot. At that point we don't really know what happens to her, All we know is that the Ocean Palace is suddenly a flying fortress, and Queen Zeal seems to be the only person alive in it. Shala just sort of disappears at that point. And it's even highlighted in the plot where, if you have one specific character in the ending, she gets directly brought up saying, are you just going to go off and see what happened to her? And that seems to be what happens. Well, if you play the DS version, and presumably the Steam version, I'm not sure I'm playing the Super Nintendo version here, you do get to see what happens to Shala, or at least a version of her. You find her at the end of the game's super dungeon attached to the final boss of the game, the Dream Devourer. Basically a super angry, more powerful version of Lavos that's fused to Shala. And even if you can defeat it in combat, it's ultimately revealed that you can't save Shala, because it's Shala's anger and rage at all of this that has perpetuated its existence and allowed her to continue existing fused to this thing as a giant unkillable source of power. She even directly says to Magus, or at least a version of Magus, that your quest for power cannot save me, because as long as man exists, as long as they vie for power, the anger I feel towards that will continue to perpetuate and this monster will never die. And effectively, she has been tormented in this weird pocket dimension where she's been exposed to the greed of humanity and the lust for power by everyone around her that sent her into this situation in the first place for all of eternity, and she always will, unless humanity can get rid of their base desire to have power and greedily make themselves better than the person next to them. And considering that humanity doesn't seem to have any sort of way of fundamentally changing this about them, because it seems to be written into our brain makeup, she's going to be trapped there forever in a pit of ever-growing hate, unable to die, unable to be absolved of this hatred, and just forced to exist and witness it for all eternity. She was a very kind, sweet girl who treated your team very, very well, who did nothing wrong in any of this, and she has the worst lot out of it, and it will never end for her. Human beings, by and large, will not change, and because of that, everything will always be made worse. And when I look outside my window and I see how things have changed since I was a kid, I very strongly agree with that, and it hits home in a very true way. And perhaps the most damning thing of all for Shala is the fact that her dear little brother, the person who meant the most to her in the world, has kind of become the biggest monster in Shala's life. Queen Zeal did nothing but lust for power, and now Shala is trapped with Lavos, a creature that Magus has done nothing but accumulate power to try and kill, because that's the only thing he can think of. He is consumed with rage to try and avenge and save his sister, and yet, in doing so, he became the thing that she feared most of all. And if anything, I would argue that that's probably an even greater tipping point. The one person she loved more than anything became the exact monster she feared and hated more than anything. And he did it all in her name. And then you have Lavos. Lavos is a weird thing to talk about, and I'm not sure I necessarily feel super strongly about it in this regard, because the thing that strikes me most about the existential dread of Lavos even existing was kind of brought about in a line of dialogue that, as I understand, isn't even in the Japanese version, so who knows how directly important to the plot it was. But when you get to the final form of Lavos with a certain party makeup, some characters will directly state everything that has happened since Lavos has appeared in regards to human evolution, politics, our ability to create things, technology, everything has all been directly influenced by Lavos itself. The idea that this giant, vaguely omniscient, almost godlike space hedgehog parasite that's been devouring the world has just been controlling everything from the background from the start. I'm not sure I necessarily believe that. I mean, going back to Queen Zeal, I always just thought that Lavos was effectively a source of magic/geothermal energy to them, and that was it. That Lavos wasn't in any sort of direct control over anything, although why he doesn't actively attack Queen Zeal when she tries to control it does lend some credence to this. But one way or the other, the fact that we as a species might have zero control over our lives, and that it's all being controlled by this worm, sleeping and devouring the world and everything in it, while we just try and live our lives, that means that we've had zero control over anything we have done in our entire lives, and every single thing we have done, said, thought about, everything has always been at the whim of something beyond us that we cannot control, and does not care about us in any way, and just seeks to destroy us from within to benefit itself. And that's horrifying. All of these characters feel effectively almost trapped in time because they cannot move forward. And it's because of this ultimate apocalypse they're all staring down, this greater sense of they are all definitely going to die because of this greater threat, and they are trapped within that they finally allow themselves to move forward past their own personal problems and grow. Maybe this is me entirely overinterpreting this, but as a human being who suffers from severe depression, as someone who has woken up and been hit with the sense of everything I do in my life, no matter what I do, will never make a difference, and no one will have ever cared I existed. This hits me so incredibly hard. But I think ultimately the theme of this game is, no matter how grim and how bad things seem, you have to keep moving forward, and you have to keep pushing and trying to find hope and meaning in what you do so that you can overcome this. And it's only then that you will ultimately build the future. And that to me is incredibly powerful. I have always been a strong believer in not talking down to children, to allow them to have the same experiences and understanding of the world events that we all have today, so that they can create their own opinions and grow as people. It's part of the reason why I find a lot of edutainment games so insufferable, because they are not designed with kids in mind, at least not respectfully. This game allows you to make these sort of interpretations, and indeed I have, and I think it's the complexity of that and the fact that it leaves you with these interpretations and these thoughts, and it's a plot that sticks with you because of its seriousness and complexity. That's really what matters so much to me and what makes the plot to Chrono Trigger so special. There were a lot of things in Chrono Trigger that just hit me on a very deep, personal, and really deeply visceral level. When you first go to the future, all you see is a desolate landscape with honestly some of the creepiest music that ever played, because you are on a dead world. And this to me was just straight up harrowing. This always made me fear what the potential future of, our real world could be if we don't actually take action to make the world a better place. Later on in the game, there is basically this giant evil flying castle in the sky that wasn't there before. It's in all the time periods. If you go back home, your character's mother will literally say that she sees it sparkling in the sky and how it's a beautiful day. And that terrified me, to think that this thing that is literally called the Black Omen, effectively the harbinger of the world's destruction, is just there, and this character sees that as a positive because it's always been there. It's benign as far as she knows, and it almost strikes me as indoctrination of a sort, that this is just a part of the world and it's perfectly fine that it's there, but we, from a different timeline, know it's not. It's not supposed to be there, and this is objectively a terrible thing that could spell the end of everything. And that just hit me in such a way that I actually was terrified of this world I was existing in. It was almost kind of like playing Majora's Mask, where you recognize every single character because you've interacted with them before, and yet their perspectives and who they are, characters, are completely different than what you expect. They're total strangers wearing the faces of people you know, and there's something about that that is just creepy. Another moment that absolutely changed how I looked at this game and felt about it, even as a child, was when you get to the future for the first time. You go to these little village areas and you find these recovery pods. They take the place of inns in this time frame. And when you go in, you get fully healed and everything's great. Your characters cheer like they always do, like, yeah, we're all healed, we're ready to go on an adventure. But then something weird happens, because your characters then suddenly look very, very sad. And one extra text box pops up, but you're still hungry. In the context of gameplay, this actually is just flavor text that means absolutely nothing, but as a child, this terrified me, because to me, it struck me as, there's hunger mechanics? I have been neglecting them this entire time. I haven't eaten anything. Have I been starving my characters, or are they all gonna die of starvation? Well, no, not really. What this means is just to imprint the plight of the people of this time. They have these magical machines that will prevent them from dying and keep them living forever, effectively, but they will be suffering forever because they cannot get food. They are starving to death and don't have the fortune to die. And that's all delivered in one singular tiny text box that struck me so hard as a child. But of course, there's one more line of text in this game that hits even more. If you go and fight Lavos at any point in the game, and you lose, you see the most terrifying words I think I've ever seen in a game over. But the future refused to change. That for all of your efforts, all of your plucky heroism, all of your actions as a player and everything you've tried to do to stack the deck to try and defeat this insurmountable god beast thing, it was all for naught, and every single thing you did up to this point was meaningless. And that alone just strikes me so much with fear and dread. As someone who deals with all sorts of existential anxiety attacks on a day-to-day basis, that line, even as a child, kind of gave me nightmares. The writing in this game hits on so many different levels, and was just really written in such a brilliant, beautiful, and horrifying way. It's done with such interesting, memorable characters in a world I want to explore and continue to see what's going on in. I was constantly, as a child, pushed every step of the way to see who these characters were, what they were all about, and how they were going to solve this world-ending catastrophe. Even if I couldn't get that far, just because I didn't really want to interact with the combat all that much, the story alone carried it. And to this day, I think the story to Chrono Trigger is honestly quite amazing. And there's plenty of twists and turns in the plot that make the adventure seem a lot bigger than you initially seem to think it is. Like, you are given immediate initial goals to work towards, but when you get to them, you realize, oh no, in order to solve this problem, we have to do a lot more. The goalposts of the adventure keep getting moved in a way that expands the world out in terms of scope, in more senses than just your map size gets bigger and you need to go somewhere else, but in terms of different time frames as well. The world and the adventure just keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger the more you play, and it makes this world just feel so huge and inviting and interesting, and I just want to explore all of it. And similar to how both the scope of the story, the map of the world, and your goals are ever expanding, so too are your characters' movesets. Not just by leveling up, you do get new abilities that way, certainly, or rather by getting enough ability experience to unlock things, but when you first come back from the future, you actually get shunted into this weird sort of time pocket dimension. The game's explanation for this is you can't have 4 different people going through time holes. One way or another, it's an arbitrary way to make sure you only ever have 3 people in your party, even though their explanation is messy at the best of times, especially considering that you could, in theory, get around this entirely by just leapfrogging your party members across time holes like the farmer, the chicken, the grain, and the fox. Either way, when you get shunted into this pocket dimension, you meet this bizarre little creature that will level up as you level up, who teaches all of your characters, who are applicable anyway, a type of magic. And from there on, you'll be utilizing magic across the game. So as the game advances, your moveset has suddenly incorporated magic, and then suddenly you'll be learning how to utilize this magic in conjunction with other things in order to properly handle your opponents in combat, and you need to do that because magic becomes an absolute requirement. In fact, arguably, before this, magic was a requirement in one specific room, unless you know how to utilize one specific ability Luca has, because there are just enemies that only take damage to magic, or will only take damage to certain elements, or will take specific debuffs to certain elements. I like this and I don't like this because it means that a lot of chunks of the game are kind of not quite scripted, but there's definitely like a beat the game button and a one specific way they want you to approach things. As soon as you get magic, after that point for like the next chapter of the game, pretty much it's just spam magic on every single enemy at every possible opportunity because they take basically no physical damage. And that's definitely one of the few downsides to the game. There is another big one that's kind of tangentially related, and that is as you progress through the game, starting about halfway through the game or so, enemies start to take a completely different mentality about them, especially the bosses. Enemies and bosses will just start throwing out attacks that likewise aren't entirely scripted or anything, but they do fixed amounts of damage. For example, you'll just see enemies quite frequently throw out attacks that just do 50% your HP worth of damage, or you'll find enemies that'll do all of your health but 1, and they'll do those fixed amounts to really kind of lower your health, and I think this was to try and counteract a weird balance problem that the developers may have been facing, because once you start getting to like level 30, 40, your health grows exponentially, and by the time you're level 50, you've maxed out the health, and I think they were trying to find a way to combat that, but the problem is it feels very sloppy, because you know that pretty much every boss after this is going to have attacks that just axe half your health, and you just need to heal every single turn to sort of get around that, even though their other attacks won't do anywhere near as much damage. I don't like this. I really, really don't. Because it kind of takes away from the uniqueness of every single boss, which is one of the greatest strengths this game had in terms of combat, was every encounter felt unique. Even just on the smaller enemy scales, if you ran into a specific combination of enemies, they might interact completely differently than if you were to fight them individually. And each boss sort of has its own mechanics that almost turns it into a completely different combat system while you're fighting them. That's really genuinely cool, and that shows that a huge amount of effort went into this game. So to see it kind of just evolve to, oh, we're just going to take half your health every single turn, so just kind of counter heal every single bit of that, you know, it feels kind of weak compared to what the rest of this game has been up to this point. The GUI to this game is absolutely atrocious, and I think the developers kind of knew it. Text boxes will just cover half the graphics on the screen at any one point, so that you can't actually see what you're supposed to be doing. It's frustrating. They tried to combat this by allowing you to swap whether the text boxes are on the top or the bottom, but if you've got text boxes on both sides, which does happen sometimes, you know, you're still not going to be seeing anything, and even if you can swap where the GUI is, top or bottom, it will still usually end up covering something important. This is why the DS version is the best version, because it relegates most of this stuff to the second screen, which to be fair isn't the most creative use of the DS, but makes this game infinitely more playable. This game even kind of acknowledges time travel in its mechanics. I mean, obviously with the jumping through time holes thing, but there are two moments in the game that actually utilize time itself as an interesting mechanic, and it doesn't even really actively acknowledge it. The first one feels a little bit more obscure. Very early on in the game, you'll run into like these treasure chests that you can't open. Very late in the game, you get the ability to open them, but those chests exist in different periods of time. If you go back into the past and open them, they will be open in the future. However, if you go into the past, unlock them, but say you don't want to open them, if you go to the future, the contents will have upgraded themselves to some of the best items in the game, and then you can go back to get the weaker versions that you could have gotten earlier if you just straight up opened the chest. Although at that point there's very little reason because you got the better version of it, but still, it's a neat little nod to the continuity of time itself. And likewise, when you beat the game, in a probably completely unintentional reference to the theory of cyclical time, when you defeat the final boss and beat the game, you will unlock a new feature, New Game Plus, which says that the events of the previous adventure will still happen the exact way they always did, but you have the power of having beaten the game before and all the stuff you've unlocked previously to go and do it again and basically just steamroll the entire game. And also fight the final boss with one character the moment you enter the fair. That's a bit of a grim fight though. Either way, I'm not sure if this was an intentional nod to the theory of cyclical time, but I'd like to think it is. This is honestly the very first game I can think of that really had a New Game Plus. I mean, sure, before this you had like arcade games and Atari 2600 games where if you beat the final level, you sort of circled back to the first level, but this is the first time where it unlocks a few secret little obscure features, but it's the same game, but you get to keep all your endgame stuff and levels and stuff, just to have a fun little victory lap around the entire game and be massively overpowered to do so. This was something I had never seen before back in the day, and I think to this day it is a feature that should be in basically everything, because New Game Plus is just a fun way to experience the game once you've beaten it. And it helps you get some of the more obscure endings, because yeah, this game has multiple endings. There are a lot, and the later versions of the game actually add additional endings as well, which is pretty cool. So having that New Game Plus feature allows you to find the more obscure nooks and crannies of the game and figure out how to get those endings. Granted, it's really more or less just when you choose to defeat the final boss in the story, but still. And it's pretty cool to see that the game actively references how far you've gotten in the game when you choose to fight the final boss, because the final boss is like 18 phases if you count everything from the first encounter to the last, but that first like 15 phase fight can be knocked down to like a 5 phase fight or a 4 phase fight or even like a 0 phase fight, just depending on how many bosses in the story you've actually fought at this point, because he amalgamates their information into him. And mechanically speaking, that's really cool. While running around the environment, you might get into fights, but this is kind of interesting because Chrono Trigger doesn't have random encounters. Pretty much every encounter in the game is actually using fixed enemies on the map, or using fixed trigger points to make enemies spawn around you in a fight. And that's pretty cool because that means if you know where all these things are, you can avoid most of the fights in the game, and that's genuinely quite interesting. Once you get into combat, it kind of initially feels a bit like a turn-based game, but it's sort of not. Each character has a bar that denotes how quickly their next attack will come up, and once that's filled, you can let loose, but you don't have to. And in rare cases, you might not want to necessarily just go in rapid fire attacks. Usually that'll get you through pretty much all the fights, but there are some where enemies and bosses will hit phases where you just don't want to attack them, or you only want to attack them with a specific ability that is owned by one specific character, so you might just have to wait until that character can go again. It makes combat substantially more strategic, and I really appreciate that. A lot of fights in the game feel like they have sort of their own bespoke mechanics around it. Certain enemies will just need to be taken out a specific way or in a specific order, or else you could be very badly punished for it, or they might just regenerate over and over again. There are certain fights that just need to be handled a very specific way that you learn through trial and error. And you learn that every enemy in this world has its own strengths and weaknesses and needs to be handled specifically in a different way than every other enemy. And that strikes me as a lot of thought and effort put into each and every encounter on the macro and micro scale. Another unique thing about combat in this game versus any other RPG ever really is that your characters each have special attacks all unique to themselves. That's pretty standard stuff, but each character also has a completely unique moveset that can interact with other teammates, using their own strengths to create larger effects. These abilities are known as double and triple techs, allowing you to combine the techniques of one character with another or potentially your entire party depending on what your team makeup is, and they can have devastating effects. However, they're not perfect. Every character needs to donate their MP to these attacks, and each character needs to be ready and prepped to attack. So you might have to sit around and wait for your second or third party member to get ready to attack before you can unleash these super abilities. But some of them are really unbelievably powerful, such as healing your entire party or attacking every enemy all at once. Another thing that really strikes me about Chrono Trigger is this game is very complicated with its characters, not just in their stories, not just in how they're written, not just in their background and their worldviews and whatever, but I mean, mechanically speaking, each character is very, very complex, and unlike a lot of other games, they don't necessarily fit into archetype terribly cleanly. Well, except for Magus, but Magus is like the odd one out in pretty much all of this. Take my girl Isla, for example. She has 3 weapons in the game, and they're all basically her fists. She cannot use magic, and she's a heavy hitter, so you might initially think that she's basically a berserker character. And you wouldn't strictly be speaking wrong in thinking that, but at the same time, she also has Charm, which is one of the most useful abilities in the game because it allows you to steal one-of-a-kind items from bosses. So you then might think she's kind of the thief, and you know, you're not wrong about that, but then you realize she also has Kiss, which is a particularly powerful healing ability because while it doesn't necessarily strictly heal all that much health compared to other healing abilities, it removes status afflictions, which there aren't a lot of those in this game. Offhand, I can think of 3 fights where it's actually important to get rid of those, but still, she also fills sort of a cleric role in her own specific way. Or take a look at Glenn. You might initially think, you know, he's kind of a tank because he's sort of a knight character. Well, he sort of is, but then, of course, he also gets magic. So what, is he some kind of red magey type character? Sorta, kinda, but he's also an anti-mage character with his Masamune sword that does extra damage to magic creatures. And of course, later on, he gets one of the most powerful healing abilities in the game because he can heal your entire party with it. Whereas up to this point, all you would have is a double tech which would incapacitate 2 separate characters in utilizing. He becomes your team's go-to white mage at this point, and indeed lasted me the entire playthrough in that role. And not every character can learn magic either. Characters like Isla and Robo existed before and after magic was invented, so they just straight up can't. So it's interesting to see that every single character kind of feels like they don't really cleanly hold any particular role. They each have their own strengths and weaknesses, but they all cover a lot of different things. While Chrono Trigger at first glance may look like a very standard RPG, when you really finally get into the nitty-gritty, it is a very mechanically complex game, and there are a lot of games that don't do anything this game did today. The idea of having your characters, and even your enemies, have complex character interactions in combat through the form of group abilities is not something you see all that frequently. And the fact that it's willing to push boundaries to make characters more than very simple archetypes is not something you see every day. Chrono Trigger does so much mechanically, both in and out of combat, and to this day, I'm honestly flabbergasted as to how amazing this game is mechanically. This game has gasted my flabber. The overall presentation of Chrono Trigger is pretty timeless. You have an art style by the late Akira Toriyama, and everything here immediately strikes me as being goofy and full of personality. A lot of the characters do feel very much like you could point at it and say that's definitely a Toriyama character, but some of these do feel like he's experimenting with his designs a little bit, and the monsters very much feel the same way. Some of the monster faces kind of remind me of the Drakis or the Slimes, but those are also timeless designs, and they work really, really well here. And like I said, every character feels very expressive. The monsters have goofy faces and they're willing to animate to like make fun of you. I remember the goblins like will stretch out their mouth and like stick their tongues at you. And like your characters will laugh and like have all these like anime exaggerated emotions to them that really make me feel like these characters are very emotive, very expressive, and very real characters. I'm reminded a lot of Final Fantasy VI, where that's a very deep and emotional game and I love it very much, but the best they can do to incite any form of emotion is have their characters kind of stare at their own feet, and that's supposed to emulate them looking sad, whereas this game, the characters just have emotions, and you can definitely see it, and the expressiveness doesn't need to be carried exclusively through the dialogue. Not to say that the dialogue doesn't do it expertly, but the animations take it to a step above pretty much any other RPG I can think of, or any other game I can think of really on the Super Nintendo. And the environmental designs feel like someone was just having an absolute field day playing with pixelated lighting to try and create the most vibrant and beautiful environments ever. It's not the nicest looking Super Nintendo game I've ever seen. Stuff like Treasure of Rudra or Bahamut Lagoon have substantially nicer sprite work with far more detail in them, but this is no slouch and definitely is still a top tier game visually. And audio-wise, honestly, I struggle to think of a soundtrack that's more impactful, meaningful, or excellent in terms of quality than Chrono Trigger. Even just the basic battle theme starts out with this absolutely killer bass line that morphs into like this ethereal chanting that goes from, oh, this is awesome, to, oh my god, this is like the world's most epic quest ever, and I'm really just fighting a standard goblin or slime or something. Seriously, the base combat theme in this game is unbelievably killer. And the character themes are no slouch either. Luca's theme is like the most hype fanfare theme ever, and Isla's theme just makes you feel awesome. The soundtrack to Chrono Trigger absolutely slaps, and this is one of the best packages I've ever seen in terms of presentation as a whole. Now, if you want a copy of Chrono Trigger on the Super Nintendo, cheapest copy I see that's official, buy it now on eBay, is $350. That is a lot for a singular game, and this might be one of the few games I would ever say is worth that, but I wouldn't recommend ever spending that kind of price for it. I didn't spend that much, and my copy's basically complete. More importantly, while this game is excellent, the Super Nintendo version is hardly the only version that exists. This was also available on the PS1 as part of a compilation in the form of Final Fantasy Chronicles, and this actually changes some things. For one thing, it adds full-on anime cutscenes, so you can really enjoy the art style that Akira Toriyama put into these characters, and that's absolutely awesome! Except that you have to put up with load times for every single fight, and that's a lot less awesome. But if you want the PS1 compilation that contains Chrono Trigger, it's about $50. That's a substantially better price. But of course, there's still other versions out there. There's also the DS version, which honestly to this day I think is the definitive way to play this game, because you have the anime cutscenes from the PS1 version, but absolutely no load times because it's all in a cartridge, and it actually adds some extra post-game content with extra dungeons and like extra bosses that actually kind of change the narrative of the game a little bit and honestly make it a lot more depressing, but it's interesting, and honestly just from the gameplay alone it's probably the go-to way, especially because it moves pretty much all the GUI down to the second screen, allowing you to actually play the game without blinding yourself with text boxes. And the cheapest complete copy I see right now on eBay is about $180. I'm not surprised at all that this game is going up in price, considering it is kind of the definitive way to play it, at least in my eyes. There are a bunch of listings for like incomplete boxes and stuff. I don't know how people keep losing the games with their boxes, but yeah, if you want like a copy that's actually gonna be like protected and stuff in its case, it's a fair bit of money, but it's a lot cheaper than the Super Nintendo version. And of course, there's Chrono Trigger on Steam. I have heard absolutely nothing good about this. From what I can tell, it's sort of kind of the DS version, but with like the GUI elements once again over top of everything. But it has all the extra content from the DS version, so there's that. I've heard it doesn't run very well. I've not tried it myself. Like I said, haven't heard anything good about it, but it's normally about 20 bucks. Which makes it like the most affordable version of Chrono Trigger, and it's the most readily available. So if you want to play Chrono Trigger in any capacity, that's probably the way to go. But again, and this is all secondhand information for me, it might not be the best experience. That said, Chrono Trigger is a very important game. I played it once as a kid and I couldn't get very far, and part of that's just because I had never experienced an RPG before, and I didn't really want to honestly interact with the whole experience leveling stat system. The idea of numbers being the sole dedicating factor of whether or not you win or not frustrated me. And it wasn't until I played Secret of Mana that I kind of learned that action RPGs existed, that you could dodge enemies' attacks and it wasn't just based on a dice roll, and that your attacks actually had to connect with enemies. Even though in Secret of Mana, that's entirely more or less a facade after the first fight. The fact is, I always wanted to go back and play Chrono Trigger because even if I couldn't really interact with the mechanics the way I would have liked and just wanted to experience the story, I knew it was special. Even if I couldn't get all that far, I knew this was a one-of-a-kind game and I wanted to explore it back then. And I'm glad that I got to do that as an adult. I've said this numerous times over the past 10 years of me making videos on YouTube. I don't script a single thing, and that's because I spent my entire life as a mute. I know that my voice is very monotone, but I made a conscientious effort to never actually write scripts to read out because it would make me even more monotone. And even though every single word I've said over the past 400 reviews I've made on this channel, I have always made a conscientious effort as I was ad-libbing to avoid very specific words. I never actively wanted to say the words perfect or masterpiece, because I don't believe there is such a game that can really fulfill either of those terms. And while I don't think there is such a thing as a perfect game, the games I would consider perfect, I can count on one hand with fingers to spare. But Chrono Trigger is one of those perfect games. And I think everyone, those who love RPGs, those who have an interest in Akira Toriyama's work, those who want to play something that is not like anything else ever made, should experience Chrono Trigger. According to the Wikipedia page, Chrono Trigger was a game designed with the superstar dream team of 3 very special individuals. Their goal? To create something that was like nothing that had ever come before. And while there's been many imitators since, many that like to compare themselves, many that aspire to be Chrono Trigger, none have ever been quite like Chrono Trigger. None have come close, and while some of them are very good, Sea of Stars is one that I hold quite dearly, it just goes to show, when you try and compare yourself to something, instead of trying to be something brand new and never before seen, you'll never eclipse that one thing. And you'll never be truly timeless. I think quite harrowing, because you have to actually watch the entire world get destroyed, and you are left with a very, very grim message. It looks bad, friend. It looks very bad. That's the same map that the current time is, but the future doesn't have a map that's remotely like this. That's a lot of places that are about to get destroyed. He's going down with the ship. And the world dies. But the future refused to change.